One leg was severed at mid-thigh, and portions of his chest and upper arm were crushed. Frozen, coagulated blood swelled like blown glass around his injuries, and shards of stone jutted from his abdomen.
"Tarvitz,"
growled Garrow, his anger greater than his pain.
"It's a war singer. Don't listen."
"Hold on, brother," said Tarvitz. "I'll be back for you."
"Just kill it,"
spat Garrow. Tarvitz looked up, seeing the war singer closer as she drifted towards the Emperor's children. Her face was serene, and her arms were open as if to welcome them. Her eyes closed as she drew the terrible song from her. Yet more blocks of stone were lifting from the pyramid around the Emperor's children. Tarvitz saw one warrior, Captain Odovacar, the bearer of the Legion banner, dragged from his feet and into the air by the war singer's chorus. His armor jerked as if torn at by invisible fingers, sparking sheets of ceramite peeling back as the war singer's power took it apart. Odovacar came apart with it, his helmet ripping free and trailing glittering streamers of blood and bone as it took his head off. As Odovacar died, Tarvitz was struck by the savage beauty of the song, a song he felt she was singing just for him. Beauty and death were captured in its discordant notes, the wonderful peace that would come if he just gave himself up to it and let the music of oblivion take him. War would end, and violence wouldn't even be a memory. Don't listen to it. Tarvitz snarled, and his bolt pistol kicked in his hand as he fired at the war singer, the sound of the shots drowned by the cacophony. Shells impacted against a sheath of shimmering force around the war singer, blooms of white light exploding around her as they detonated prematurely. More and more of the Astartes, Emperor's children and Death Guard both, were being pulled up into the air and sonically dismembered, and Tarvitz knew they didn't have much time before their cause was lost. The surviving Istvanian soldiers were regrouping, storming up the pyramid after the Astartes. Tarvitz saw Lucius among them, swords slashing black-armored limbs from bodies as they fought to surround him. Lucius could look after himself, and Tarvitz forced himself onwards, struggling to keep his footing amid the chaos of the war singer's wanton destruction. Gold gleamed ahead of him, and he saw Eidolon's armor shining like a beacon in the war singer's light. The Lord Commander bellowed in defiance and pulled himself up the last few levels of the pyramid as Tarvitz climbed to join him. The war singer drew a shining call of light around her, and Eidolon plunged into it, the glare becoming opaque like a shining white shell. Tarvitz's pistol was empty, so he dropped it, taking a two-handed grip on his sword and following his Lord Commander into the light. The deafening shrieks of the war singer filled his head with deathly unmusic, rising to a crescendo as he penetrated the veil of light. Eidolon was on his knees, his hammer lost, and the war singer hovering over him. Her hands stretched out in front of her as she battered Eidolon with waves of force strong enough to distort the air. Eidolon's armor warped around him, his helmet ripped from his head in a wash of blood, but he was still alive and fighting. Tarvitz charged, screaming, "For the Emperor!" The war singer saw him and smashed him to the floor with a dismissive flick of her wrist. His helmet cracked with the force of the impact, and for a moment his world was filled with the awful beauty of the war singer's song. His vision returned in time for him to see Eidolon lunging forwards. His charge had brought Eidolon a momentary distraction, the harmonics of her song redirected for the briefest moment. The briefest moment was all the warrior of the Emperor's children needed. Eidolon's eyes were ablaze, his hatred and revulsion at this foe clear, as his mouth opened in a cry of rage. His mouth opened still wider, and he let loose his own screeching howl. Tarvitz rolled onto his back, dropping his sword and clutching his hands to his ears at the dreadful sound. Where the war singer's song had led its death in beguiling beauty, there was no such grace in the sonic assault launched by Eidolon. It was simply agonizing, deafening volume. The crippling noise smashed into the war singer, and suddenly her grace was torn away. She opened her mouth to sing a fresh song of death, but Eidolon's scream turned her cries into a grim dirge. Sounds of mourning and pain layered over one another into a heavy funereal drone as the war singer dropped to her knees. Eidolon bent and picked up Tarvitz' fallen broadsword, his own terrible scream now silenced. The war-singer writhed in pain, arcing coils of light whipping from her as she lost control of her song. Eidolon waded through the light and noise. The broadsword licked out, and Eidolon cut the war-singer's head from her shoulders with a single sweep of silver. Finally, the war-singer was silent. Tarvitz clung to the crumbling summit of the pyramid and watched as Eidolon raised the sword in victory, still trying to understand what he had seen. The war-singer's monstrous harmonies still rang in his head, but he shook them off as he stared in disbelief at the Lord Commander. Eidolon turned to Tarvitz and dropped the broadsword beside him. "A good blade," he said. "My thanks for your intervention." "How?" was all Tarvitz could muster, his senses still overcome with the deafening shriek Eidolon had unleashed. "Strength of will, Tarvitz," said Eidolon. "That's what it was. Strength of will. The bitch's damn magic was no match for a pair of warriors like us, eh?" "I suppose not," said Tarvitz, accepting a hand up from Eidolon. The dome was suddenly, eerily silent. The Estvanians who still lived were slumped where they had fallen at the war-singer's death, weeping and rocking back and forth like children at the loss of a parent. "I don't understand," he began, as warriors of the Death Guard started securing the dome. "You don't need to understand, Tarvitz," said Eidolon. "We won. That's what matters. But what you did, what I did was kill our enemies," snapped Eidolon. "Understood?" "Understood," nodded Tarvitz, although he no more understood Eidolon's newfound ability than he did the celestial mechanics of traveling through the war. Eidolon said, "Kill any remaining enemy troops, then destroy this place," before turning and making his way down the shattered pyramid to the cheers of his warriors. Tarvitz retrieved his fallen weapons and watched the aftermath of victory unfolding below him. The Astartes were regrouping, and he made his way back down to where he had left the wounded Garrow. The captain of the Death Guard was sitting propped up against the side of the pyramid, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing, and Tarvitz could see it had taken a supreme effort of will not to let the pain balms of his armor render him unconscious. "Tarvitz, you're alive," said Garrow as he climbed down the last step. "Just about," he said. "More than can be said for you." "This?" sneered Garrow. "I've had worse than this. You mark my words, lad. I'll be up and teaching you a few new tricks in the training cages again before you know it." Despite the strangeness of the battle and the lives that had been lost, Tarvitz smiled. "It's good to see you again, Nathaniel," said Tarvitz, leaning down and taking Garrow's proffered hand. "It has been too long since we fought together." "It has that, my honor, brother," nodded Garrow. "But I have a feeling we will have plenty of opportunities to fight as one before this campaign is over." "Not if you keep letting yourself get injured like this. You need an apothecary." "Nonsense, boy. There's plenty worse than me that need a sore bones first." "You never did learn to accept that you'd been hurt, did you?" smiled Tarvitz. "No," agreed Garrow. "It's not the Death Guard way, is it?" "I wouldn't know," said Tarvitz, waving over an Emperor's Children apothecary, despite Garrow's protests. "You're too barbarous a legion for me to ever understand. And you're a bunch of pretty boys more concerned with looking good than getting the job done," said Garrow, rounding off the traditional insults that passed for greetings between them. Both warriors had been through too much in their long friendship and saved each other's lives too many times to allow formality and petty differences between their legions to matter. Garrow jerked his thumb in the direction of the summit. "You killed her?" "No," said Tarvitz. "Lord Commander Eidolon did." "Eidolon, eh?" mused Garrow. "Never did have much time for him. Still, if he managed to bring her down, he's obviously learned a thing or two since I last met him." "I think you might be right," said Tarvitz. Chapter 6. The Soul of the Legion. Everything will be different. Abomination. Loken found Abaddon in the observation dome that blistered from the hull of the upper decks of the Vengeful Spirit, the transparent glass looking out onto the barren wasteland of Istvan Extremis. The dome was quiet and dark, a perfect place for reflection and calm. and Abaddon looked out of place. His power and energy like that of a caged beast, poised to attack. "Loken," said Abaddon as he walked into the chamber, "you summoned me here."
I did.
"Why?" demanded Abaddon.
Loyalty.
Said Loken simply. Abaddon snorted. "You don't know the meaning of the word. You have never had it tested."
Like you did on Darwin.
"Ah," sighed Abaddon. "So that is what this is about. Don't think to lecture me, Loken. You couldn't have taken the steps we did to save the War Master."
Maybe I'm the only one who took a stand.
"Against what? You would have allowed the War Master to die rather than accept that there might be something in this universe you don't understand."
I'm not here to debate what happened on Darwin,
said Loken, already feeling that he had lost control of the conversation. "Then why are you here? I have warriors to make ready, and I won't waste time with you on idle words."
I called you here because I need answers. About this,
said Loken, casting the book he had taken from the fane behind the strategium onto the mosaic floor of the observation dome. Abaddon stooped to retrieve the book. In the hands of the first captain, it looked tiny, like one of Ignace Carcass's pamphlets. "So you're a thief now," said Abaddon.
Do not dare speak to me of such things, Ezekiel. Not until you have given me answers. I know that Erebus conspired against us. He stole the anatheme from the Interrex and brought it to Darwin. I know it, and you know it.
"You know nothing, Loken," sneered Abaddon. "What happens in this crusade happens for the good of the Imperium. The War Master has a plan."
A plan, said Loken. And this plan requires the murder of innocent people. Hector Varvarus, Ignace Carcassy, Petronella Vivar.
"The Remembrancers," laughed Abaddon. "You really care about those people? They are lesser people, Loken, beneath us. The Council of Terror wants to drown us in these petty bureaucrats, to stifle us and strangle our ambitions to conquer the galaxy."
Erebus,
said Loken, trying to keep his anger in check.
Why was he on the vengeful spirit?
Abaddon crossed the width of the observation dome in a second. "None of your damn business."
"This is my legion,"
shouted Loken.
"That makes it my damn business."
"Not anymore." Loken felt his collar rise and clenched his hands into murderous fists. Abaddon saw the tension in him and said, "Thinking of settling this like a warrior?"
"No, Ezekiel,"
said Loken through clenched teeth.
"Despite all that has happened, you are still my Mournival brother, and I will not fight you."
"The Mournival," nodded Abaddon. "A noble idea while it lasted, but I regret ever bringing you in. In any case, if it came down to bloodshed, do you really think you could beat me?" Loken ignored the taunt and said,
"Is Erebus still here?"
"Erebus is a guest on the War Master's flagship," said Abaddon. "You would do well to remember that. If you had joined us when you had the chance, instead of turning your back on us, you would have had all your answers. But that's a choice you made, Loken. Live with it."
The Lodge has brought something evil into our legion, Ezekiel. Maybe the other legions too. Something from the warp. It's what killed Jubal, and it's what took Temba on Darwin. Erebus is lying to all of us.
And we're being used, is that right? Erebus is manipulating us all towards a fate worse than death, spat Abaddon. You know so little. If you understood the scale of the War Master's designs, then you would beg us to take you back.
Then tell me, Ezekiel, and maybe I'll beg. We were brothers once, and we can be again.
Do you really believe that, Loken? You've made it plain enough that you're against us. Torgadden said as much.
For my legion, for my War Master, there is always a way back, replied Loken. As long as you feel the same.
But you'll never surrender, eh?
Never. Not when the soul of my legion is at stake.
Abaddon shook his head. We tie ourselves in such knots because men like you are too proud to make compromises.
Compromise will be the death of us, Ezekiel.
Forget this until after Istvan, Loken, ordered Abaddon. After Istvan, this will end.
I will not forget it, Ezekiel. I will have my answers,
snarled Loken, turning and walking away from his brother.
"If you fight us, you'll lose,"
promised Abaddon.
"Maybe,"
replied Loken.
"but others will stand against you. Then they will die too."
"Thank you all for coming," said Cinderman, overwhelmed and a little afraid at the number of people gathered before him. "I appreciate that you have all taken a great risk to be here. But this is too much." Crammed into a dark maintenance space, filthy with grease and hemmed in by low, hissing pipework, the faithful had come from all over the ship to hear the saint's words, mistakenly believing that she was awake. Amongst the crowd, Cinderman saw the uniforms of Titan crewmen, fleet maintenance workers, medical staff, security personnel, and even a few Imperial Army troopers. Men with guns guarded the entrances to the maintenance space, and their presence served as a stark reminder of the danger they were in just by being here. Such a large gathering was dangerous, too easily noticed, and Cinderman knew that he had to disperse them quickly before they were discovered, and do it in such a way as not to incite a riot. "You have escaped notice thus far thanks to the size of your gatherings, but so many cannot avoid notice for long," continued Cinderman. "You will no doubt have heard many strange and wonderful things recently, and I hope you will forgive me for putting you in harm's way." The news of Keeler's rescue had spread quickly through the ship. It had been whispered among the grime-covered ratings. It had been communicated through the Remembrancer Order with the rapidity of an epidemic, and it had reached the ears of even the lowliest member of the expedition. Embellishments and wild rumor followed in the wake of the news, and tales abounded of the saint and her miraculous powers. Incredible stories of bullets turned aside, and of visions of the Emperor speaking directly to her in order to show his people the way. "What of the saint?" asked a voice from the crowd. "We want to see her." Cinderman held up a hand and said, "The saint is fortunate to be alive. She is well, but she still sleeps. Some of you have heard that she is awake, and that she has spoken, but regrettably this is not the case." A disappointed buzz spread throughout the crowd, angry at Cinderman's denial of what many of them desperately wanted to believe. Cinderman was reminded of the speeches he had given on newly compliant worlds, where he had used his iterator's wiles to extol the virtues of the imperial truth. Now he had to use those same skills to give these people hope. "The saint still sleeps, it's true. But for one brief, shining moment, she arose from her slumbers to save my life. I saw her eyes open, and I know that when we need her, she will come back to us. Until then, we must walk warily, for there are those in the fleet who would destroy us for our beliefs. The very fact that we must meet in secret and rely on armed guards to keep us safe is a reminder that Malakhurst himself regularly sends troops to break up the meetings of the Lectitio Divinitatis. People have been killed, and their blood is on the hands of the Astartes. Ignace Carcassy, Emperor rest his soul, knew the dangers of an unchecked Astartes before any of us realized their hands were around our throats. Once, I could not believe in such things as saints. I had trained myself to accept only logic and science, and to cast aside religion as superstition. Magic and miracles were impossible, simply the invention of ignorant people struggling to understand their world. It took the sacrifice of the saint to show me how arrogant I was. I saw how the Emperor protects, but she has shown me that there is so much more than that. For if the Emperor protects his faithful, who protects the Emperor?" Cinderman let the question hang. "We must," said Titus Cassar, pushing his way towards the front of the crowd and turning to address them. Cinderman had placed Cassar in the crowd with specific instructions on when to speak, a basic ploy of the iterators to reinforce their message. "We must protect the Emperor, for there is no one else," said Cassar. The Moderati looked back at Cinderman. "But we must stay alive in order to do so. Is that not right, Iterator?" "Yes," said Cinderman. "The faith that this congregation has displayed has caused such fear in the higher echelons of the fleet that they are trying to destroy us. The Emperor has an enemy here. Of that I am sure. We must survive, and we must stand against that enemy when it finally reveals itself. Worried and angry murmurings spread through the crowd as the deadly nature of the threat sank in. "Faithful friends," said Cinderman, "the dangers we face are great, but the saint is with us, and she needs shelter. Shelter we can best achieve alone, but watch for the signs and be safe. Spread the word of her safety." Kassar moved through the congregation, instructing them to return to their posts. Reassured by Cinderman's words, they gradually began to disperse. As he watched them go, Cinderman wondered how many of them would live through the coming days. The gallery of swords ran the length of the Andronius, like the ship's gilded spine. Its roof was transparent, and the space beneath was lit by the fire of distant stars. Hundreds of statues lined the gallery, heroes of the Emperor's children, with gemstone eyes and stern expressions of judgment. The worth of a hero was said to be measured by how long he could meet their gaze while walking the length of the gallery of swords beneath their unforgiving eyes. Tarvitz held his head high as he entered the gallery, though he knew he was no hero, simply a warrior who did his best. Chapter masters and commanders from long ago glared at him, their names and noble countenances known and revered by every warrior of the Emperor's children. Entire wings of the Andronius were given over to the fallen battle brothers of the Legion, but it was here that every warrior hoped to be remembered. Tarvitz had no expectation of his visage ending up here, but he would strive to end his days in a manner that might be considered worthy of such an honor. Even if such a lofty goal was impossible, it was something to aspire to. Eidolon stood before the graven image of Lord Commander Teliosa, the hero of the Madrivane campaign. And even before Tarvitz drew near, he turned to face him. "Captain Tarvitz," said Eidolon, "I have rarely seen you here."
"It is not my natural habitat, Commander," replied Tarvitz. "I leave the heroes of our Legion to their rest."
"Then what brings you here now?"
"I would speak with you, if you would permit me."
"Surely your time is better spent attending to your warriors, Tarvitz. That is where your talents lie."
"You honor me by saying so, Commander, but there is something I need to ask you."
"About?"
"The death of the war singer."
"Ah." Eidolon looked up at the statue towering over them, the hollow eyes regarding them with a cold, unflinching gaze. "She was quite an adversary. Absolutely corrupt. But that corruption gave her strength."
"I need to know how you killed her."
"Captain? You speak as if to an equal."
"I saw what you did, Commander," Tarvitz pressed. "That scream. It was I don't know, some power I've never heard of before."
Eidolon held up a hand. "I can understand why you have questions, and I can answer them. But perhaps it would be better for me to show you. Follow me." Tarvitz followed the Lord Commander as they walked further down the gallery of swords, turning into a side passage with sheets of parchment pinned along the length of its walls. Accounts of glorious actions from the Legion's past were meticulously recorded on them, and novices of the Legion were required to memorize the many different battles before their elevation to full Astartes. The Emperor's children did more than just remember their triumphs. They proclaimed them, because the perfection of the Legion's way of war deserved celebrating. "Do you know why I fought the war singer?" asked Eidolon.
"Why?"
"Yes, Captain. Why?"
"Because that is how the Emperor's children fight.
"Explain."
Our heroes lead from the front. The rest of the Legion is inspired to follow their example. They can do this because the Legion fights with such artistry that they are not rendered vulnerable by fighting at the fore."
Eidolon smiled. "Very good, Captain. I should have you instruct the novices. And you yourself, would you lead from the front?" Sudden hope flared in Tarvitz's breast.
"Of course. Given the chance, I would. I had not thought you considered me worthy of such a role."
"You are not, Tarvitz. You are a file officer and nothing more," said Eidolon, crushing his faint hope that he had been about to be offered a way of proving his mettle as a leader and a hero. "I say this not as an insult," Eidolon continued, apparently oblivious to the insult it clearly was. "Men like you fulfill an important role in our Legion. That I am one of Fulgrim's chosen. The Primarch chose me and elevated me to the position I now hold. He looked upon me and saw in me the qualities needed to lead the Emperor's children. He looked upon you and did not. Because of this, I understand the responsibilities that come with being Fulgrim's chosen in a way that you cannot, Captain Tarvitz. Eidolon led him to a grand staircase that curved downwards into a large hall, tiled with white marble. Tarvitz recognized it as one of the entrances to the ship's apothecarium, where the injured from Istvan Extremis had been brought only a few hours before.
I think you underestimate me, Lord Commander,
said Tarvitz.
but understand that for the sake of my men, I must know.
For the sake of our men, we all make sacrifices, snapped Eidolon. For the chosen, those sacrifices are great. Foremost among these is that fact that everything is secondary to victory.
Commander, I don't understand.
You will, said Eidolon, leading him through a gilded archway and into the central apothecarium.
The book?
Asked Torgadden.
The book, repeated Loken. It's the key. Erebus is on the ship. I know it.
The ashen darkness of Archive Chamber 3 was one of the few places left on the vengeful spirit where Loken felt at home, remembering many a lively debate with Kirill Sinderman in simpler times. Loken had not seen the Iterator for weeks, and he fervently hoped that the old man was safe, that he had not fallen foul of Malaghurst or his faceless soldiers.
Abaddon and the others must be keeping him safe,
said Torgadden. Loken sighed.
How did it come to this? I would have given my life for Abaddon. Aximand, too. And I know they would have done the same for me. We can't give up on this, Garviel. There will be a way out of this. We can bring the Mournival back together, or at least make sure the War Master sees what Erebus is doing. Whatever that is. Yes, whatever that is. Guest of the Lodge or not, he's not welcome on my ship. He's the key. If we find him, we can expose what's going on to the War Master and end this. You really believe that? I don't know. But that won't stop me trying.
Torgadden looked around him, stirring the ashes of the charred books on the shelves with a finger, and said,
Why did you have to meet me here? It smells like a funeral pyre. Because no one ever comes here, said Loken. I can't imagine why, seeing as how pleasant it is. Don't be flippant, Tarek. Not now. The Great Crusade was once about bringing illumination to the far corners of the galaxy. But now it is afraid of knowledge. The more we learn, the more we question. And the more we question, the more we see through the lies perpetrated upon us. To those who want to control us, books are dangerous. Iterator Loken, laughed Torgadden. You've enlightened me. I had a good teacher, said Loken, again thinking of Kirill Sinderman, and the fact that everything he had been taught to believe was being shaken to its core. And there's more at stake here than a split between Astartes. It's philosophy, ideology, religion even. Everything. Kirill taught me that this kind of blind obedience is what led to the Age of Strife. We've crossed the galaxy to bring peace and illumination, but the cause of our downfall could be right here amongst us.
Torgadden leaned over, put a hand on his friend's shoulder.
Listen, we're about to go into battle on Istvan 3, and the word from the Death Guard is that the enemy is led by some kind of psychic monsters that can kill with a scream. They're not the enemy because they read the wrong books or anything like that. They're the enemy because the War Master tells us they are. Forget about all this for a while. Go and fight. That'll put some perspective on things. Do you even know if we'll be headed down there? The War Master's picked the squads for the spear tip. We're in it, and it looks as if we'll be in charge too. Really? After all that's happened? I know, but I won't look a gift horse in the mouth. At least I'll have the 10th with me.
Torgadden shook his head.
Not quite. The War Master hasn't chosen the spear tip by company. It's squad by squad.
Why?
Because he thinks that confused look on your face is funny. Please, be serious, Tarek.
Torgadden shrugged.
The War Master knows what he's doing. It won't be an easy battle. We'll be dropping right on top of the city. What about Lacaster? You'll have them. I don't think you could have held Vipers back anyway. You know what he's like. He'd have stowed away on a drop pod if he'd been left out. He's like you. He needs to clear his head with a good dose of fighting. After Istvan, things will get back to normal. Good. I'll feel a lot better with Lucasta backing us up. Well, it's true that you need the help, smiled Torgadden. Loken chuckled, not because Torgadden was actually funny, but because even after everything he was still the same. A person that he could trust, and a friend he could rely on. You're right, Tarek, said Loken. After Istvan, everything will be different. The central apothecarium gleamed with glass and steel, dozens of medical cells branching off from the circular hub of the main laboratory. Tarvitz felt a chill travel the length of his spine as he saw Captain Odovakar's ruined body suspended in a stasis tank, waiting for its gene seed to be harvested. Eidolon marched through the hub and down a tiled corridor that led into a gilded vestibule, dominated by a huge mosaic depicting Fulgrim's victory at Tarsus, where the Primarch had vanquished the deceitful Eldar despite his many grievous wounds. Eidolon reached up and pressed one of the enameled chips that formed Fulgrim's belt, standing back as the mosaic arced upwards, revealing a glowing passageway and winding spiral staircase beyond. The lack of ornamentation was a contrast to the rest of the Andronius, and Tarvitz saw a cold blue glow emanating from whatever lay below as he made his way down the stairs. As they reached the end of their descent, Eidolon turned to him and said, "This, Captain Tarvitz, is your answer." The blue light shone from a dozen ceiling-high translucent cylinders that stood against the sides of the room. Each was filled with liquid with indistinct shapes suspended in them, some roughly humanoid, some more like collections of organs or body parts. The rest of the room was taken up by gleaming laboratory benches covered in equipment, some with purposes he couldn't even begin to guess at. He moved from tank to tank, repulsed as he saw that some were full of monstrously bloated flesh that was barely contained by the glass. "What is this?" asked Tarvitz in horror at such grotesque sights. "I fear my explanations will be insufficient," said Eidolon, walking towards an archway leading into the next room. Tarvitz followed him, peering more closely at the cylinders as he passed. One contained an Astartes-sized body, but not a corpse, more like something that had never been born, its features sunken and half-formed. Another cylinder contained only a head, but one which had large, multifaceted eyes like an insect. As he looked closer, Tarvitz realized with sick horror that the eyes had not been grafted on, for he saw no scars, and the skull had reshaped itself to accommodate them. They had been grown there. He moved on to the last cylinder, seeing a mass of brains linked by fleshy cables held in liquid suspension, each one with extra lobes bulging like tumors. Tarvitz felt a profound chill coming from the next room, its walls lined with refrigerated metal cabinets. He briefly wondered what was in them, but decided he didn't want to know, as his imagination conjured all manner of deformities and mutations. A single operating slab filled the center of the room, easily large enough for an Astartes warrior to be restrained upon, with a chirurgeon device mounted on the ceiling above. Neatly cut sections of muscle fiber were spread across the slab. Apothecary Fabius bent over them, the hissing probes and needles of his narthecium embedded in a dark mass of glistening meat. "Apothecary," said Eidolon, "the captain wishes to know of our enterprise." Fabius looked up in surprise, his long, intelligent face framed by a mane of fine blonde hair. Only his eyes were out of place, small and dark, set into his skull like black pearls. He wore a floor-length Medicae gown, blood streaking its pristine whiteness with runnels of crimson. "Really?" said Fabius. "I had not been made aware that Captain Tarvitz was among our esteemed company." "He is not," said Eidolon. "Not yet, anyway." "Then why is he here?" "My own alterations have come to light." "Ah, I see," nodded Fabius. "What is going on here?"
asked Tarvitz sharply.
"What is this place?"
Fabius cocked an eyebrow. So, you have seen the results of the commander's augmentations, have you?
Is he a psyker?
Demanded Tarvitz. No, 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 laughed Fabius. He is not. The Lord Commander's abilities are the result of a tracheal implant combined with alteration in the gene seed rhythms. He is something of a success. His powers are metabolic and chemical, not psychic.
You have altered the gene seed,
Breathed Tarvitz in shock.
The gene seed is the blood of our Primarch. When he discovers what you are doing here.
Don't be naive, Captain, said Fabius. Who do you think ordered us to proceed?
No,
Said Tarvitz.
he wouldn't.
That is why I had to show you this, Captain, said Eidolon. You remember the cleansing of Leiran?
Of course,
Answered Tarvitz. Our Primarch saw what the Leia had achieved by chemical and genetic manipulation of their biological structure in their drive for physical perfection. The Lord Fulgrim has great plans for our Legion, Tarvitz. The Emperor's children cannot be content to sit on their laurels while our fellow Astartes win the same dull victories. We must continue to strive towards perfection. But we are fast reaching the point where even an Astartes cannot match the standards Lord Fulgrim and the War Master demand. To meet those standards, we must change. We must evolve. Tarvitz backed away from the operating slab.
the Emperor created Lord Fulgrim to be the perfect warrior, and the Legion's warriors were molded in his image. That image is what we strive towards. Holding a Xenos race up as an example of perfection is an abomination.
An abomination? Said Eidolon. Tarvitz, you are brave and disciplined, and your warriors respect you, but you do not have the imagination to see where this work can lead us. You must realize that the Legion's supremacy is of greater importance than any mortal squeamishness. Such a bold statement, its arrogance and conceit, beyond anything he had heard Eidolon say before, stunned Tarvitz to silence. But for your unlikely presence at the death of the War Singer, you would never have been granted this chance, Tarvitz, said Eidolon. Understand it for the opportunity it represents. Tarvitz looked up at the Lord Commander sharply.
What do you mean?
Now you know what we are attempting. Perhaps you are ready to become a part of this Legion's future, instead of simply one of its line officers. It is not without risk, Fabius pointed out. But I could work such wonders upon your flesh. I can make you more than you are. I can bring you closer to perfection. Think of the alternative, said Eidolon. You will fight and die, knowing that you could have been so much more. Tarvitz looked at the two warriors before him, both Fulgrim's chosen, and both exemplars of the Legion's relentless drive towards perfection. He saw then that he was very, very far from perfection, as they understood it, but for once welcomed such a failing, if failing it was.
No,
he said, backing away.
this is wrong. Can you not feel it?
Very well, said Eidolon. You have made your choice, and it does not surprise me. So be it. You must leave now, but you are ordered not to speak of what you have seen here. Return to your men, Tarvitz. Istvan III will be a tough fight.
Yes, Commander,
said Tarvitz, relieved beyond measure to be leaving this chamber of horrors. Tarvitz saluted and all but fled the laboratory, feeling as though the specimens suspended in the tanks were watching him as he went. As he emerged into the brightness of the apothecarion, he could not shake the feeling that he had just been tested. Whether he had passed or failed was another matter entirely. Chapter 7. The God Machine. A Favor. Subterfuge. The cold sensation snaking through Kassar's mind was like an old friend, the touch of something reassuring. The metallic caress of the Dies Irae as its cortical interfaces meshed with his consciousness would have been terrifying to most people, but it was one of the few constants Moderati Titus Kassar had left in the galaxy. That and the Lectitio Divinitatis. The Titan's bridge was dim, lit by ghostly readouts and telltales that lined the ornate bridge in hard greens and blues. The Mechanicum had been busy, sending cloaked adepts into the Titan, and the bridge was packed with equipment he didn't yet know the purpose of. The deck crew manning the plasma reactor at the war machine's heart had been readying the Titan for battle since the vengeful spirit arrived in the Istvan system, and every indication was that the Dies Irae's major systems were all functioning better than ever. Kassar was glad of any advantage the war machine could get, but somewhere, deep down, he resented the thought of anyone else touching the Titan. The interface filaments coiled deeper into his scalp, sending an unexpected chill through him. The Titan's systems lit up behind Kassar's eyes as though they were part of his own body. The plasma reactor was ticking over quietly, its pent-up energy ready to erupt into full battle order at his command. Motivation systems are a little loose, he said to himself, tightening the pressure on the massive hydraulic rams in the Titan's torso and legs. Weapons hot, ammunition loaded, he said, knowing that it would take no more than a thought to unleash them. He had come to regard the power and magnificence of the Dies Irae as the Emperor personified. Kassar had resisted the thought at first, mocking Jonah Arukan's insistence that the Titan had a soul, but it had become more and more obvious why he had been chosen by the Saint. The Lectitio Divinitatis was under threat, and the faithful had to be defended. He almost laughed aloud as the thought formed, but what he had seen on the Medicaid deck had only deepened the strength of his conviction that he had chosen the right path. The Titan was a symbol of that strength, an avatar of divine wrath, a god machine that brought the Emperor's judgment to the sinners of Istvan. "The Emperor protects," whispered Kassar, his voice drifting down through the layers of readouts in his mind. "And he destroys."
Does he now?
Kassar snapped out of his thoughts, and the Titan's systems retreated beneath his consciousness. He looked up in sudden panic, but let out a relieved breath as he saw Moderati Arukan standing over him. Arukan snapped a switch, and the bridge lights flickered to life.
Be careful who hears you, Titus. Now more than ever.
"I was running through pre-battle checks," said Kassar.
Of course you were, Titus. If Princeps Turnit hears you say things like that, you'll be for it.
"My thoughts are my own, Jonah. Not even the Princeps can deny me that."
You really believe that? Come on, Titus. You know full well this cult stuff isn't welcome. We were lucky on the Medicaid deck, but this is bigger than you and me, and it's getting too dangerous.
"We can't back away from it now," said Kassar. "Not after what we saw."
I'm not even sure what I saw, said Arukan defensively.
"You're joking, surely."
No, insisted Arukan. I'm not. Look, I'm telling you this because you're a good man, and the Dies Irae will suffer if you're not here. She needs a good crew, and you're part of it.
"Don't change the subject," said Kassar. "We both know that what we saw on the Medicaid deck was a miracle. You have to accept that before the Emperor can enter your heart."
Listen, I've been hearing some scuttlebutt on the deck, Titus, said Arukan, leaning closer. Turnit's been asking questions about us. He's asking about how deep this runs, as though we're part of some hidden conspiracy. It's as if he doesn't trust us anymore.
"Let him come."
You don't understand. When we're in battle, we're a good team. And if we get, I don't know, thrown in a cell or worse, that team gets broken up. And there isn't a better crew for the Dies Irae than us. Don't let this saint business break that up. The crusade will suffer for it.
"My faith won't allow me to make compromises, Jonah."
Well, that's all it is, snapped Arukan. Your faith.
"No," said Titus, shaking his head. "It's your faith too, Jonah. You just don't know it yet."
Arukan didn't answer and slumped into his own command chair, nodding at the readouts in front of Kassar. How's she looking?
"Good. The reactor is ticking over smoothly, and the targeting is reacting faster than I've seen it in a while. The Mechanicum adepts have been tinkering, so there are a few more bells and whistles to play with."
You say that as if it's a bad thing, Titus. The Mechanicum know what they're doing. Anyway, the latest news is that we've got 12 hours to go before the drop. We're going in with the Death Guard on support duties. Princeps Turnit will brief us in a few hours, but it's basically pounding the ground and scaring the shit out of the enemy. Sound good?
"It sounds like battle," It's all the same thing for the Dies Irae when the bullets are flying, said Arukin.
This reminds me of why I was so proud,
said Loken, looking at the spear tip assembling on the Vengeful Spirit's embarkation deck.
Joining the Mournival, and just to be a part of this.
I'm still proud, said Torgadden. This is my legion. That hasn't changed. Loken and Torgadden, fully armored and ready for the drop, stood at the head of a host of Astartes. More than a third of the legion was there, thousands of warriors arrayed for war. Loken saw veterans alongside newly inducted novices, assault warriors with chainswords and bulky jump packs, and devastators hefting heavy bolters and las cannons. Sergeant Lacoste was speaking with his communications squad, making sure they understood the importance of keeping a link with the Vengeful Spirit once they were down in the Coral City. Apothecary Vadden was checking and rechecking his medical gear, the Narthesium gauntlet with its cluster of probes and the reductor that would harvest gene seed from the fallen. Yacton Cruz, who had been a captain for so long that he was as old as an Astartes could be and still count himself a warrior, was lecturing some of the more recent inductees on the past glories of the Legion that they had to live up to.
I'd be happier with the 10th,
said Loken, returning his attention to his friend. And I with the 2nd, replied Torgadden. But we can't always have what we want. Garvey, called a familiar voice. Loken turned and saw Nero Vipus approaching them, leaving the veterans of Lacasta to continue their preparations for the drop.
Nero,
said Loken.
Good to have you with us.
Vipers clapped Loken's shoulder guard with the augmetic hand that had replaced the organic one he'd lost on 6319. I wouldn't have missed this, he said.
I know what you mean,
replied Loken. It had been a long time since they had lined up on the Vengeful Spirit as brothers, ready to fight the Emperor's good fight. Nero Vipus and Loken were the oldest of friends, back from the barely remembered blur of training, and it was reassuring to have another familiar face alongside him. Have you heard the reports from Istvan Extremis? Asked Vipus, his eyes alight.
Some of them.
They say the enemy has got some kind of psychic leadership caste, and that their soldiers are fanatics. My collar's up just thinking about it. Don't worry, said Torgadden. I'm sure you'll kill them all. It's like Davin again, said Vipus, baring his teeth in a grimace of anticipation.
It's not like Davin,
said Loken.
There's nothing at all like Davin.
What do you mean? It's not a bloody swamp for a start, interjected Torgadden.
It would be an honor if you'd go into battle with Locasta, Garvey, said Vipus expectantly. I have a space in the drop pod. The honor is mine,
replied Loken, taking his friend's hand as a sudden thought occurred to him.
Count me in.
He nodded to his friends and made his way through the bustling Astartes towards the solitary figure of Yacton Cruz. The half-herd watched the preparations for war with undisguised envy, and Loken felt a stab of sympathy for the venerable warrior. Cruz was an example of just how little even the Legion's apothecaries knew of an Astartes physiology. His face was as battered and gnarled as ancient oak, but his body was as wolf tough, honed by years of fighting and not yet made weary by age. An Astartes was functionally immortal, meaning that only in death did duty end, and the thought sent a chill down Loken's spine.
Loken,
acknowledged Cruz as he saw him approach.
You're not coming down to see the sights of the Siren Hold with us?
Asked Loken.
Alas, no, said Cruz. I am to stay and await orders. I haven't even got a place in the order of battle for the pacification force.
If the War Master has no plans for you, Yacton, then I have something you could do for me, said Loken. If you would do me the honor.
Cruz's eyes narrowed.
What sort of a favor?
Nothing too arduous, I promise you.
Then ask.
There are some remembrances aboard. You may have heard of them. Mercedy Ollerton, Euphrates Keeler, and Kirill Sinderman.
Yes, I know of them,
confirmed Cruz.
What of them?
They are friends of mine, and I would consider it an honor if you were to seek them out and ask after them. Check on them and make sure that they are well.
Why do these mortals matter to you, Captain?
They keep me honest, Yacton,
smiled Loken.
And they remind me of everything we ought to be as Astartes.
That I can understand, Loken,
replied Cruz.
The Legion is changing, boy. I know you've heard me bore you with this before, but I feel in my bones that there's something big just over the horizon that we can't see. If these people help keep us honest, then that's good enough for me. Consider it done, Captain Loken.
Thank you, Yakton, said Loken. It means a lot to me.
Don't mention it, boy, grinned Cruz. Now, get out of here and kill for the living.
I will,
promised Loken, taking Cruz's wrist in the warrior's grip.
Spear tip units to posts,
said the booming voice of the deck officer.
Good hunting in the siren hold, said Cruz. Lupercal,
Lupercal,
echoed Loken. As he jogged towards Locasta's drop pod, it almost felt as if the events of Darwin were forgotten, and Loken was just a warrior again, fighting a crusade that had to be won, and an enemy that deserved to die. It took war to make him feel like one of the sons of Horus again.
to victory!
Shouted Lucius. The Emperor's children were so certain of the perfection of their way of war that it was traditional to salute the victory before it was won. Tarvitz was not surprised that Lucius led the salute. Many senior officers attended the pre-battle celebration, and Lucius was keen to be noticed. The Astartes seated at the lavish banquet around him joined his salute, their cheers echoing from the alabaster walls of the banqueting hall. Captured banners, honored weapons once carried by the chosen of Fulgrim, and murals of heroes dispatching alien foes hung from the walls, glorious reminders of past victories. The Primarch himself was not present. Thus, it fell to Eidolon to take his place at the feast, exhorting his fellow Astartes to celebrate the coming victory. Lucius was equally vocal, leading his fellow warriors in toasts from golden chalices of fine wine. Tarvitz set down his goblet and rose from the table.
Leaving already, Tarvitz?
Sneered Eidolon.
Yes, chimed in Lucius. We've only just begun to celebrate.
I'm sure you will do enough celebrating for both of us, Lucius, said Tarvitz. I have matters to attend to before we make the drop.
Nonsense, said Lucius. You need to stay with us and regale us with memories of murder and how I helped you defeat the scourge of the Megarachnids.
The warriors cheered and called for Tarvitz to tell the story once more, but he held up his hands to quiet their demands.
Why don't you tell it, Lucius? Asked Tarvitz. I don't think I build your part up enough for your liking anyway.
That's true,
smiled Lucius.
Very well, I'll tell the tale.
Lord Commander,
said Tarvitz, bowing to Eidolon, and then turning to make his way through the golden door of the banquet hall. Appealing to Lucius's vanity was the surest way of deflecting his attention. Tarvitz would miss the camaraderie of the celebration, but he had other matters pressing on his thoughts. He closed the door to the banqueting hall as Lucius began the tale of their ill-fated expedition to murder, though its horrifying beginnings had somehow become a great triumph, largely thanks to Lucius, if past retellings were anything to go by. The magnificent processional at the heart of the Andronius was quiet, the droning hum of the vessel reassuring in its constancy. The ship, like many in the Emperor's Children fleet, resembled some ancient palace of terror, reflecting the Legion's desire to infuse everything with regal majesty. Tarvitz made his way through the ship, passing wondrous spaces that would make the shipwrights of Jupiter weep with awe, until he reached the Hall of Rites, the circular chamber where the Emperor's children underwent the oaths and ceremonies that tied them to their legion. Compared to the rest of the ship, the hall was dark, but it was no less magnificent. Marble columns supporting a distant domed ceiling, and ritual altars of marble glittering in pools of shadow at its edges. Fulgrim's chosen had pledged themselves to the Primarch's personal charge here, and he had accepted his appointment as captain before the altar of service. The Hall of Rites replaced opulence with gravity, and seemed designed to intimidate with the promise of knowledge hidden from all but the Legion's most exalted officers. Tarvitz paused on the threshold, seeing the unmistakable shape of ancient Rylanor, his dreadnought body standing before the altar of devotion.
And,
said Rylanor in his artificial voice. Tarvitz cautiously approached the ancient, his blocky outline resolving into a tank-like sarcophagus supported on powerful piston legs. The dreadnought's wide shoulders mounted an assault cannon on one arm and a huge hydraulic fist on the other. Rylanor's body rotated slowly on its central axis to face Tarvitz, turning from the book of ceremonies that lay open on the altar. "Captain Tarvitz, why are you not with your warriors?" asked Rylanor. His ocular circuits regarded Tarvitz without emotion.
"They can celebrate well enough without me," said Tarvitz. "Besides, I have sat through one too many renditions of Lucius's tales to think I'll miss much."
"It is not to my taste either," said Rylanor, a grating bark of electronic noise sounding from the dreadnought's Vox unit. At first, Tarvitz thought the Ancient had developed a fault until he realized that the sound was Rylanor's laughter. Rylanor was the Legion's Ancient of Rites, and when not on the battlefield, he oversaw the ceremonies that marked the gradual ascent of an Astartes from novice to chosen of Fulgrim. Decades before, Rylanor had been wounded beyond the skill of the Legion's apothecaries while fighting the duplicitous Eldar, and had been interred in a dreadnought war machine that he might continue to serve. Along with Lucius and Tarvitz, Rylanor was one of the senior officers being sent down to take the Coral City's palace complex.
"I wish to speak with you, revered Ancient,"
said Tarvitz.
"about the drop."
"The drop is in a few hours," replied Rylanor. "There is little time."
"Yes. I have left it too late, and for that I apologize. But it concerns Captain Odovakar."
"Captain Odovakar is dead, killed on Istvan Extremis."
"And the Legion lost a great warrior that day,"
nodded Tarvitz.
"Not only that, but he was to function as Eidolon's senior staff officer aboard the Andronius, relaying the commander's orders to the surface. With his death, there is no one to fulfill that role."
"Eidolon is aware of Odovakar's loss. He will have an alternative in place."
"I request the honor of fulfilling that role,"
said Tarvitz solemnly.
"I knew Odovakar well, and would consider it a fitting tribute to finish the work he began on this campaign."
The dreadnought leaned close to Tarvitz, the cold metallic machine unreadable, as the crippled warrior within decided Tarvitz's fate. "You would renounce the honor of your place in the spear tip to take over his duties." Tarvitz looked into Rylanor's optics, struggling to keep his expression neutral. Rylanor had seen everything the Legion had gone through since the beginning of the Great Crusade, and was said to be able to perceive a lie the instant it was told. His request to remain aboard the Andronius was highly unusual, and Rylanor would surely be suspicious of his motives for not wanting to go into the fight. But when Tarvitz had learned that Eidolon was not leading the spear tip personally, he knew there had to be a reason. The Lord Commander never passed up the opportunity to flaunt his martial prowess, and for him to appoint another in his stead was unheard of. Not only that, but the deployment orders Eidolon had issued made no sense. Instead of the normal, rigorously regimented order of battle that was typical of an Emperor's Children assault, the units chosen to make the first attack appeared to have been picked at random. The only thing they had in common was that none were from chapters led by Eidolon's favored Lord Commanders. For Eidolon to sanction a drop without any of the warriors belonging to those Lord Commanders was unheard of and grossly insulting. Something felt very wrong about this drop, and Tarvitz couldn't shake the feeling that there was some grim purpose behind the selection of these units. He had to know what it was. Rylanor straightened and said, "I shall see to it that you are replaced. This is a great sacrifice you make, Captain Tarvitz. You do the memory of Odovakar much honor with it." Tarvitz fought to hide his relief, knowing that he had taken an unthinkable risk in lying to Rylanor. He nodded and said,
"My thanks, Ancient."
"I shall join the troops of the spear tip," said the dreadnought. "Their feasting will soon be complete, and I must ensure that they are ready for battle."
"Bring perfection to the Coral City,"
said Tarvitz. "Guide us well," replied Rylanor, his voice loaded with unspoken meaning. Tarvitz was suddenly certain that the dreadnought wanted Tarvitz to remain on the ship. "Do the Emperor's work, Captain Tarvitz," ordered Rylanor.